So today I'm at Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek, Michigan, and I'm standing near the grave of a man named V.C. Squire. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about his story and some of the history of how he impacted Battle Creek. So come along and join me. Many books and essays have been written over the centuries about Antonio Stradivari, the famous Italian craftsman of string instruments bearing the name Stradivarius. Few perhaps know the story of a world-famous Michigan violin maker who lived in Battle Creek, Victor Carroll Squier. His craftsmanship perhaps does not eclipse the original Stradivarius, but his craftsmanship was internationally known and respected and sought after in his time. Victor Carroll Squier, who better known in his time as V.C. Squire, was born in Battle Creek on November 27, 1866. His grandfather was Stephen Raymond, who purchased land along the Kalamazoo River from Sans McCamley in the 1840s or 1850s and operated Battle Creek's first tannery. Victor Squire's father was Jerome Bonaparte Squire, a native of Cleveland who came to Battle Creek when he was 16 years old because he had heard of Stephen Raymond and was anxious to acquire the shoemaking trade. The story of his arrival here was related that he walked most of the way here barefooted at that. I suppose that would inspire anyone to learn how to make shoes. Raymond at the time had a farm where he maintained a journeyman shoe shop employing interested shoemakers that came along. Jerome Squire not only learned the shoemaking trade, but he married Raymond's daughter, Olive B. Raymond, in 1864. 5 years later, he bought land along what is now present-day Southwest Capitol Avenue, which had once been occupied by a brickmaker for a future place of business. And then he moved with the Raymonds into a house on Kalamazoo Street in downtown where Victor was born. Kalamazoo Street today is Jackson Street. They later moved to Harmonia for a few years to a building which had been built by the Wilson family. Harmonia no longer exists, and for more information on the history of this lost village, watch my video Searching for Harmonia. In the spring of 1870, Jerome moved his family back to Battle Creek again to the property that he had purchased along Capitol Avenue Southwest. This was the year of the Great Chicago Fire, and Victor recalled later in his life how people stood in the streets and marveled at the extent of smoke from that fire 160 miles away that obscured the whole town of Battle Creek. Victor remembered as a child he was personally very frightened as he expected the fire would sweep down upon them at any moment. At the age of 4, one is not such a good judge of distances. Jerome Squire developed his new business producing charts for shoemaking. With special tools, he engraved patterns for shoes on boxwood and punched holes to form out lines and transferred these lines to leather. He put the kit on the market for $5 each, and it proved to be a boon to shoemakers who had previously followed a sort of guessing method. He called his invention the Boston shoe pattern, not because he was familiar with Boston or from there, but because he hoped to be one day. He eventually moved downtown and occupied the northwest corner of what we know today as the old post office. Following this, Jerome's ambition to go east was too much for him to bear, and he went away to Maine and then eventually to Boston, and he never came home. He left behind his wife and children. Establishing himself in Boston, he continued in the shoe business, but also began to venture into violin manufacturing and other string instruments. Following his departure, it came out that Jerome had had an affair with another woman, and it made the newspapers. Mrs. Squire, however, published in the paper that their separation was mutual and that she would sanction their marriage once she and Jerome were legally divorced. Jerome and Olive were eventually divorced, and she continued raising the children on her own. Victor was not the only child. Besides Victor, he had a brother named Edmund, who as an adult became an owner of an orchard in Wisconsin, where he grew apples and pears and cherries. He also had a sister, Effie, who had become Effie Tilden, but unfortunately passed away at the age of 20. And he also had another younger brother who died in infancy. In 1880, his mother remarried Warren Gould, a contractor who was best known in his time as the director of the Battle Creek Symphony Orchestra. Warren converted the old shoe shop on Southwest Capitol into a carpenter's shop after they were married, and then they moved to what is now known as Rose Street. Victor was 14 years old and remembered the night after their wedding that the Nichols and Shepherd Company band arrived in the evening to serenade the newlyweds. His mother would go on to have another son named Raymond Gould. Oddly enough, Warren would leave in 1884 for 2 years, spending time in the Washington Territory, returning in 1886. I tried to surmise why he went out there. During that time period in Washington Territory, there was a lot of iron mining going on, as well as a growing fishing trade, as per the territorial governor's report from 1884. So perhaps he was working in one of those industries. He would pass away 2 years after his return in 1888, and he's buried at Beckley Cemetery. Victor entered Battle Creek High School, but eventually quit and went to work chopping wood and doing odd jobs until at the age of 18, he landed a job at a grocery store. The owner was in the habit of trading groceries for firewood with local farmers, and it was Victor's job to carry the wood. He worked such long hours that he found it easier to sleep at the store, and the business owner eventually set up a room for him in the back. Victor then began to work for a shoe store until he received a request, more like a direct order from his father, to join him in Boston, where Jerome Squier was now making violins. So young Victor made the journey to Boston. Victor Squier took to violin making, as he described it later, like a duck takes to water. He stayed working with his father in Boston for 5 to 6 years, and then went to Worcester, Massachusetts for work for a famous violin maker named William L. Peters. After a year with Peters, he decided to try working with his father again, but then soon decided that he couldn't get along with him, so he joined French violin maker Truffle Gervais. In 1888, Victor fell in love with a singer, Mabel Spear, and a year later they were married. They lived in Boston, but the romance went on the rocks after 2 years. Compounding the problem, business became bad in Boston from strikes tying up industries, so the couple moved to Battle Creek, knowing that Victor's mother would gladly welcome them to come live with her. In 6 months, however, Mabel became homesick for Boston and returned home. She ultimately became a singer of prominence and toured the country with Mapleton's Grand Opera Company. Her favorite role was Carmen, and she was very good. She spent 2 years touring the country and at times wrote Victor about coming home, but he couldn't see that the marriage would ever work again, so they eventually got divorced. In 1890, Victor opened his own violin shop in a frame building on Lake Avenue. He began by writing letters to leading violinists in many cities around the country, and eventually orders came in for repairs and spare parts. Soon he began selling bows and strings and even cases. Over the years he expanded the building and it became a prominent fixture in Battle Creek. You can see the building here on the 1919 Sanborn fire insurance map. The building still exists today. Lake Avenue was eventually renamed Capitol Avenue Southwest, and today the building is Worry Engineering. In 1893, he married Mary Jeanette Ellsworth, whose father was a foreman for the Upton Works. In his business, his chief aide was a man named Gus Crawford, who had been a jeweler from childhood, whose talents were easily converted to becoming a string maker. Crawford would remain in the employ of V.C. Squire for over 40 years until his own death in 1933, where he was one of 7 violin makers in the company at that point. Strings at the time were wound by foot power, and it was a tedious job. But in 1895, Crawford got the idea of converting a sewing machine into an automatic winder, which produced better strings and more rapidly. The company began widely producing and distributing strings for all forms of string instruments and even other applications such as tennis rackets. Squire was also a major employer of women in Battle Creek at the string factory. Remember that this was a time period where there were not a lot of factory jobs available for women in this area. Squier recalled in an article once that he called on a violin dealer in Detroit and talked to him about his string business and was laughed at because they'd always bought their strings from overseas. He convinced him to let him send him some samples, and the company was so impressed with the product that they began selling Squier strings from there on. Later, a New York dealer who had been buying German strings suggested he submit some Squier strings to them, and the result was a massive order which he could not execute. To the rescue was his half-brother Raymond Gould, whom Victor had been very fond of and even taught him how to play violin at age 11. Raymond was now 16 and tired of school, so he came to the Squier plant to make strings. The business continued to grow and expanded again in 1927 to a larger building. Raymond would become manager and treasurer of the business over time and remained working with Victor throughout his life, long after Victor's death. They established a downtown branch at 90 East Michigan Avenue in 1930. In 1932, they moved to 44 East Michigan Avenue, opening a storefront, which today is a parking lot. And in 1943, the store would be moved to 60 West Michigan Avenue, where Rice Shoes is today. The 60 West Michigan Avenue location was previously the Charles E. Rote Music Company, established by Charles E. Rote, which Victor eventually acquired after Mr. Rote passed away from his estate. Being a rival business, the two music stores used to compete with each other in tennis competitions. In 1931, the V.C. Squire Company earned bragging rights when they beat the Rote duo 6-1. I wanted to briefly interrupt to let you know if you'd like to support the work that I do on this channel, you can visit the links below and either make a direct donation through my LibrePay account or shop my merchandise store. Check out my newest design featuring Old Hannibal the Elephant. Now through February 14th, use the offer code VALENTINE for a 15% discount because that's Blue's birthday. Now let's get back to the story. Victor and Mary had a daughter, Victoria, who married Floyd Parsons. Here they are pictured together, Floyd on the left and Victoria in the center, talking to a chairman of the Red Cross in 1947. Floyd would work at the music store as a fixture for many years alongside Teddy Ellsworth, Mary's brother, and the brother-in-law of V.C. Squire. Here they are pictured together in the music store. Victor Squire always had a flair for the dramatic and participated in plays with Lakeview Players when they were active. He also aligned himself with the Civic Players, and his music store was always the box office for advanced sale of seats. His wife was also active in theater and made several local appearances, perhaps most well known for her portrayal of Marma in Little Women. Victor also was a writer, writing over 20 plays, 10 of which were produced by local small theaters throughout the city. He also wrote a book about Antonio Stradivari and another one entitled Old and New Florida Tales, which was a popular book down south. He also wrote numerous articles for trade papers and magazines. In the final years of his life, Victor began working on a novel built around his own life and experiences. But it's unknown today where that manuscript ended up, although a reprint of the book that he wrote about Antonio Stradivari can be found on Amazon. Victor died in 1949 at the age of 83. Still active in his music business in the weeks before his passing. His company continued to operate in the Battle Creek area until 1975, having become an international known brand name in strings. In the 1930s, the company also sold pianos, radios, and phonograph records until it eventually divested itself of the other products and violin manufacturing and focused entirely on string manufacturing in 1961, the same year that Raymond Gould passed away. Fender Electric Instruments entered the picture in the 1950s, and the V.C. Squire Company began supplying the Southern California company strings for the businessman Leo Fender and his new electric guitars. By 1963, the V.C. Squire Company had become an official original equipment manufacturer for Fender. Fender eventually acquired the V.C. Squire Company in early 1965, shortly before Fender itself itself was acquired by CBS in May of that same year. By the mid-1970s, the Squire name was retired and the strings had taken on the Fender name. Fender, however, did revitalize the Squire name when it introduced a Squire line of guitars in August 1982, which offered popular low-priced models. The Squire series of guitars, although having evolved since the 1980s, are still available today. V.C. Squire's father, Jerome Squire, passed away in 1912 at the age of 78 and was well known in his time in Boston as a violin maker. However, it was V.C. Squire that made the name Squire internationally famous. Today, the name Squire is considered to be a vintage name with old roots in the world of music. Today, Squire violins are often sought after by collectors and musicians, and the Smithsonian National Museum of American History has a display of one of the violins made in 1925 and used by his niece Olive, which she was given as a gift on her high school graduation, and she used it until 1962. So that's going to do it for today's tour through the history of V.C. Squire and the music company that he founded. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you liked the video today, please take a minute to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share the video with others. And I'll talk to you soon.